My name is John Dominic Crossan. I'm a professor emeritus of religious studies at DePaul University in Chicago, Illinois. And as a footnote, emeritus is a Latin term that means I don't have to live in Chicago. I get to live in Central Florida. This is my academic autobiography. I'm actually doing part one. It's from 1934 to 1945, and there will be other parts to follow. Also, as you recognize, I'm using an oral register and a visual register for my autobiography rather than the more usual written or textual register for autobiography. As happens so often to couples, my parents, my mother and father, met by accident or coincidence or chance. My mother, Elizabeth Farry, was born and living in Ballymote, County Sligo, more or less in the western part of Ireland. My father, Daniel Joseph Crossan, always DJ for short, was born in Letterkenny, County Donegal, which is not contiguous to County Sligo, but he was working as a cashier in the Hibernian Bank in Portumna, County Galway. Let me put in a footnote. The Hibernian Bank was founded in 1825 because the largest and more original bank in Ireland, the Bank of Ireland, was not, well, let me put it, it discriminated against Roman Catholics. So the Hibernian was founded by Dublin businessmen, was not by a private family or owned by a single individual, but Dublin businessmen, including Daniel O'Connell, who was earlier in that century teaching the Irish how to do non-violent legal resistance against the British Empire. All right, come back to my parents. In the late 20s, my father, as I said, was a cashier in Portumna, County Galway, the Hibernian Bank, and he was sent, by chance if you will, to fill in for a colleague who was on vacation, in the summer vacation probably, in the Hibernian Bank in my mother's hometown of Ballymote, County Sligo. So the two of them, in the late 20s, were together in the same place, and I suppose the rest was biology and history. The picture in the extreme right, the photo in the extreme right, was taken during the summer of 1933. I know the year and I know the time because my father is dressed in tennis whites. And I was born in early 1934, so this would be my first, shall I say, non-appearance in a photograph, because I'm certainly there with my mother. Portumna, County Galway, 1933. Here is a tale of two towns, the much smaller Portumna, County Galway, and the larger, maybe 5 or 6 times as large, Nenagh, County Tipperary, in two adjacent counties. Here is the story about them. My parents, as you remember, were living in Portumna, County Galway, when I was about to be born, but my parents decided that they would travel across the Shannon from Portumna to Nenagh to the larger town for the birth. They did not go to a hospital, but to a place called the O'Neill Maternity Home. It was owned by a Mrs. O'Neill and her sister, Mrs. Tompkins, who was the resident certified midwife. I have a picture here, a modern picture, of the building, and you can tell by the heights of the roofs that 5 Mitchell Street, which was the maternity home to the right, was quite separate from the other building to its left, which would have been, I think, 4 Mitchell Street or 6 Mitchell Street. I've forgotten how the count went. In any case, the height of the roofs tell you that these two buildings were later amalgamated into a single home above a single shop. Thus, on 17th of February 1934, at 5 Mitchell Street in Nenagh, County Tipperary, I got myself born. Years later, very, very grateful to my mother for where she decided to get me born, because when I wrote my memoir, I called it A Long Way from Tipperary, playing, of course, on the famous World War I marching song, 1914 to 1918, which was A Long Way to Tipperary. That worked for me. It would not have worked so well if I'd been born in Portumna, County Galway, because a long way from Galway doesn't actually sound quite as good. At the top of each section, I'm going to put in the right-hand top corner the actual dates, so I can keep tabs myself of where I am and you can know as a viewer. So the last one was 1934, obviously, for my birth. We are now in 1935 to 45, and you will notice we're no longer in Portumna, County Galway, but in Naas, County Kildare. Here's what's going on. When the Hibernian Bank promoted members, they very often moved them around to different branches. So my father was promoted from being a cashier in Portumna, County Galway, to being an accountant in the Hibernian Bank in Naas, County Kildare, and so of course the family had to move there. But I want to begin with 1942, when I was 8 years old, and I was told I was going to be, I don't think I was invited, I was told I was going to be, by the school, an altar boy in the parish church in Naas, County Kildare. My wife Sarah and I went back a couple of times in the early 20s. Last time I think was 2017. And we took a lot of these pictures because I wasn't taking any pictures at 8 years of age. In any case, I became an altar boy in 1942. And I really want to spend some time here because it's very important for my formative, generative, constitutive future, what that meant to me and what it didn't mean especially. For me at 8, being an altar boy did not honestly mean extra piety or any great religious accomplishment. First of all, Roman Catholicism was the wallpaper of Ireland, as it were. And becoming an altar boy wasn't that big a deal, actually. It wasn't an ultra pious altar call or anything like that. It was simply you were going to be assisting at the ceremonies, the Mass especially, but other ritual ceremonies as well. The image you're looking at is one we took when we went back years later, and it's showing the inside of the parish church in Naas, as it is now, and absolutely not as it was when I was there in 1942 as an altar boy, and 43 and 44 and 45, of course. The biggest change was that altar, which is now out from the wall so the priest can stand behind it facing the congregation, was up against the wall on 3 steps, and the priest had his back to the congregation. So when you're imagining me as an altar boy, I am kneeling on the bottom step there, say during Mass, and the priest has his back turned to me. Again, the major thing for me, let me repeat, was being an altar boy was a challenge and an adventure. That's what it was. So it means that my first experience of deep involvement in religion, more than say the Rosary at home or the Stations of the Cross or the standard other Roman Catholic devotions, the first deep experience was religion is about challenge and adventure. More than say piety or anything else, it was a big adventure. And let me detail that adventure a little bit. For example, language. We had to learn the Latin responses because this was the Latin Mass before the Second Vatican Council of 62 to 65, so it was all in Latin. The priest, for example, began the Mass by saying, in Latin of course, Introibo ad altare Dei, I will enter onto the altar of God. And as an altar boy, I had to respond in Latin, ad Deum qui letificat juventutem meum, to God who gives joy to my youth. And that's a mouthful, by the way, in Latin. I had to memorize it, and the parish priest, Father Doyle, didn't group mistakes too easily. So it was not, he didn't want to mumble the Latin or fumble the Latin. And of course, everyone could hear you, so you had to say it loudly and clearly. So that was the first challenge. Second challenge. The altar was high, of course, and big, tall candlesticks. So when you're lighting the candles before Mass, and everyone is sort of there watching, you had to take the taper, reach way up as high as your arm could go, and try and light the wicks that you couldn't see way up above your head, and hope they would take. There were 6 of them as far as I remember. Another thing, another challenge. The Roman Catholic Missal, which was like the big Bible of Ireland, of Roman Catholicism. Instead of the Bible, which I'd never seen, of course, at the time, we had this big Roman Missal, and it was situated on a big, heavy brass stand. So early in the Mass, the altar boy had to walk up those 3 steps. And by the way, I was wearing a black soutane down to my shoes, so I had to do a sort of a kick step, so I didn't stumble and catch the soutane with my foot. Anyway, I'd get up to what was the right-hand side, the epistle side, pick up this great big heavy book and stand, hold it tight to my chest, and then go down the 3 steps, genuflect at the bottom, up the other 3 steps to the right side, the gospel side, because that's what you're doing. You're transferring the missal from one side to the other. Reach up and get it up on the altar, and kind of do all of that without dumping the whole ensemble at the priest's feet and his back was turned to you. One final challenge. Maybe this was the biggest one. At the ritual called Benedictus, you were using a thurible, or a type of censer with long chains. And in that thurible were live coals. And you had to hold it up so the priest could put incense on top of the live coals. Now, of course, you weren't supposed to set yourself on fire. You weren't supposed to set the priest on fire. You weren't supposed to spill the hot coals on the altar or anything else. Those were all challenges. That's actually the way I saw religion. It's a challenge. It's an adventure. And if you can do this, it's an accomplishment. And I found it marvelous. At 8, of course, and still much later. For me, at 8 years of age in 1942, and continuing into 43, 44, and 45 until we left Naas in 1945, being an altar boy did not mean, emphatically did not mean, I was ultra pious as a kid, or ultra religious, or anything like that at all. It had everything to do with challenge and adventure, with accomplishing a challenge and experiencing an adventure. That's what it was really about. And that's not just looking back. That's the way it was at the time. Years later, Sarah and I went back to Naas to take that photograph of the inside of the church. That is as it is now, not, emphatically not, as it was in the 1940s. That was after Vatican II, the Second Vatican Council in 1962-65. For example, look at that altar. Before the Vatican Council, that was up against the wall, the back wall, under the stained glass, and it had 3 steps leading up to it, and 6 great big tall candles and candlesticks atop of the altar. That's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about myself as an altar boy, say every morning at 6:30 Mass, or on Sundays, of course, a couple of times, or in any other rituals of the Roman Catholic tradition. So, what was the challenge? Well, there was about 4 of them, all intertwined. First of all, there was the Latin language. This was the Latin Mass, again before the council changed things to the vernacular. So the priest spoke Latin, and I had to know at 8 years of age, I had to know the responses in Latin. For example, at the very beginning, the priest would say from the Psalms, introibo ad altare Deum, I enter onto the altar of God. And I had to reply in my best 8-year-old voice, but loud and clear so the congregation could hear it. Not that they understood it necessarily, but they had to hear it. Ad Deum qui laetificat juventutem meum, to God who gives joy to my youth. So that was the first challenge. And by the way, the parish priest, Father Doyle, had a low impatience with mistakes. You were very careful to get it right and get it right all the time. First, then, challenge. Second adventure. Those big candles. I had to light them before Mass, and the congregation was already there, of course, so everyone was behind me, and I had a taper, and I had to lift it up, and it was as far as I could reach up with my one hand, with my right arm, to try and get to the wicks that I could not see of those high candles, and hope I could get it and get them going, because all 6 had to be lit before Mass began. Second challenge. Third challenge. They're getting harder. The great big Bible, if you will, of Roman Catholicism is the Roman Missal. It's heavy, and it rested on a heavy brass stand. Now, early in the Mass, you had to take that, the altar boy had to take it, from the right-hand side, which was the epistle side of the altar as you faced it, over to the gospel side, the left side of the altar as you faced it. At 8 years of age, then I had to walk up those steps. Now, I was wearing a full-length black soutane, so not to stumble over it, I had to kind of do a kick step to clear the soutane away from my feet, reach up, grab the heavy brass stand with its heavy Roman Missal, walk down, 3 steps down, genuflect in the center towards the altar, then up again 3 steps, and lift it up onto the altar. And of course, preferably without dumping the whole ensemble at the feet of the priest, whose back was turned to me. Finally, maybe the fourth challenge of all, not in the Mass, but in a special ritual called benediction. This involved a thurible, which is a type of censer with long chains, and in the bottom of it were live coals, burning coals, and you had to lift that up with the cover off, present it to the priest, who was going to put incense on the live coals. You also had to do that at high masses, by the way. And of course, you did not want to set yourself on fire, the priest's vestments on fire, nor the altar cloths on fire. In general, you didn't want to cause any arson whatsoever. So, those were the challenges. I repeat, nothing to do with ultra piety or ultra religion. Everything to do with responding to challenges and experiencing adventures. That was my first deep experience of religion. I knew, of course, growing up about the Rosary and the Stations of the Cross and all the other ways in which you learned the history of Christianity through liturgical devotions. But this was my deep immersion with it. Helping the priest's vest, for example, all of that. And it came across as adventure. Looked to me like God had the best adventure going. That never changed for the rest of my life. It got in early, It set my character. It never changed. When I became an altar boy in 1942 at 8 years of age, and of course it continued in 1943, 44, 45 until we left Naas, what I want to emphasize is that I really was not ultra pious or ultra religious or was thinking of my future or anything at all like that at 8. What struck me becoming an altar boy was this is a challenge and an adventure. It's a challenge to be accomplished. It's an adventure to be experienced. That's what was really important and would be formative, I think, for the rest of my whole life. Because this is my first deep experience with religion. Of course, we knew the Rosary, we knew the Stations of the Cross, we knew all the devotions of the Roman Catholic liturgy. But this was a fairly deep immersion, getting to know the priests, helping them vest and divest before and after Mass, getting to 6:30 Mass every morning, multiple Masses on Sunday, and all the other rituals of the Roman Catholic tradition. This was a deep experience of religion, and it came across as challenge and adventure, as a challenge to be accomplished and an adventure to be experienced. And religion has always, to this day, remained a question for me, not of piety or devotion, so much as of challenge and adventure. I thought then, I still think, God has the most interesting challenge then in town, I would have said, now in the world. In any case, look at that picture. It's quite different from the way that church would have been on the inside. This is, of course, the inside of the parish church in Naas. When my wife went back, and I went back, Sarah and I went back, we were back in 05, 06, 07, 2015, 2017. We took pictures of the way things were then. So this is the way the inside of that parish church looks now. Major difference. Look at that altar. The altar now is out from the back wall, so the priest is behind the altar facing the congregation. Then, before the Second Vatican Council, that altar was back tight against the wall, below the stained glass window, up on 3 steps, 6 big high candlesticks, maybe 4 or 5 feet high above the altar, and the priest was standing in front of it, kind of leading the congregation, his back towards the congregation. That's the situation you're imagining when I talk about challenge and adventure. And basically for me at 8 years of age, and of course continuing, as I said, those other years, as long as I was an altar boy there was about 4 major challenges that I think of looking back now, but they were there then. First of all, there was the language. This was the Latin Mass. It was changed to the vernaculars in the Second Vatican Council, 62 to 65, but this was the Latin Mass. So, for example, at the beginning of the Mass, the priest would say in Latin, from the Psalms, Introibo ad altare Dei. I enter onto the altar of God. And in my best 8-year-old voice, but loud enough so the congregation could hear the response, I would reply in Latin, ad Deum qui laetificat juventutem meum, to God who gives joy to my youth. And again, I repeat, it had to be clear enough so everyone heard it. And the parish priest, whose name I remember, Father Doyle, had no patience at all with mistakes and let you know very clearly if you had made one. A second challenge, a second adventure. This concerned the Roman Missal, the great big heavy Roman Missal, which is sort of honestly the Bible of Roman Catholicism. At least it certainly was then. I don't think I'd ever seen a Bible at this stage. It was up on a very heavy brass stand. And early in the Mass, you had to, the altar boy, myself, had to transfer it from the right-hand side, called the epistle side, to the left-hand side, called the gospel side. So you had to walk up those 3 rather tall steps. Now I was wearing a floor-length black soutane, which meant I had not to stumble on it going up those steps. I couldn't hold it up in any way. So kick, step to get it clear. When you got up there, you took this heavy brass stand with its heavy missile on it, clutched it to your chest, as it were, down the steps, genuflected in the middle, up the steps again, kick, step, lifted the whole thing up onto the left side of the altar, and preferably without dumping the whole ensemble any way along the route. So, next challenge, those candles. At the beginning of Mass, all 6 had to be lit, and the priest wouldn't come out until they were lit from the sacristy. So I had to reach up with a taper at the end of a rod, and it was as high, I remember, to get my right hand up, holding the taper, and try and set the wicks of those I couldn't see the wicks, by the way. I had to figure that, I know they're up there, I gotta believe, they're up there, and get them going, get them lit. And the final, maybe the most dangerous one of all, the final challenge, was during the liturgy called benediction. Well, it also happened during high masses. You were using a thurible, which is a form of censer with a lot of strings on it, and it held live burning coals. And your job as an altar boy was to lift up the cap over the coals and hold it up so the priest could take incense and put it on the live coals, burning incense. Of course, the plan was not to set yourself on fire, not to set the priest's vestments on fire, not to set anything on fire, nor, of course, to dump the coals out on the altar steps. So those were the major challenges I can think of looking back. But again, I repeat, challenge and accomplishment, adventure and experience. That was what was being an altar boy when I was 8. And that meant that my first really deep challenge, deep experience, I should say, of religion, deep immersion in religion, was as adventure. Not as piety, not even as devotion, but as venture. I thought God had the greatest adventure going. I still do multiple decades later, because that got in early and never changed. There was one other important, formative, and constitutive experience that I had in those years in Naas from 1935 to 1945. We were living in what's called Glenville Terrace. It was a row of Victorian terrace homes. I think they were probably built around 1870 and 1870s. And terraces are quite common in towns, but not usual outside the town, just outside the town. So we're in Naas, County Kildare, of course, as you remember from the church, and we're on the main Naas-Dublin Road, or Dublin-Naas Road. It's now gone into the Naas bypass, so this road is not quite so important now, which was in those days. You'll notice there's 6 houses, and they're counted not from left to right, but from right to left, from the town, as it were. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and we're in number 5, which you can see there. There was a large sloping garden out front. You can tell how old they are by the amount of the trees and other foliage. But also behind, there were very large gardens, greens, as it were. I think they were big enough to have a tennis court, maybe a bit squished, but we never did that, of course. But they were very nice places. But I'm primarily interested in that road, the old main road from Naas to Dublin. And I'm talking about the years, say, 43, 44, 45. The last 3 years we were in Naas. And I'm there for 9, 10, 11 years of age. And here's what was formative for me long after. Not, of course, recognized at the time any more than the experience of the altar boy was recognized as formative for the future. Go back to 1939. Obviously, of course, the Second World War began in Europe in September of 1939. My father, the family, had a 1933 Vauxhall car, and of course petrol was now rationed. Gasoline was now going to be rationed. If you were a doctor, you could get your ration. If you were a bank, it was a banker, it wasn't. You didn't need to have it. So doctors did, bankers didn't. My father drove the Vauxhall back behind the house to its garage for the last time, jacked up the axles on big stout butter boxes, and left it there untouched for 6 years. He went out then and bought a bike. And as you remember from that first picture, he liked motorbikes and cars. Bikes weren't quite in the planning. In any case, he had a bike, and therefore could ride in from our house just a little bit to Naas. In the same way as I went from the house every morning to be an altar boy at Mass for the 6:30 Mass. It wasn't that far. But here's the point. Starting probably around 43, 44, my father and I started having long, long walks on the Naas-Dublin Road. It would be on this side, where we are as viewers. There was a footpath along that road. The footpath on the other side that you can see was just in front of those houses. So we went, I'm going to say, about an hour there and an hour back. We just walked on the road. We didn't go anywhere particular, just along the road. And by the way, in those years, it wasn't a very crowded road with cars, obviously. As fun and entertainment, here's what my father did on those walks. And again, I had no idea how important it was going to be for me. First of all, he had graduated from boarding school, from, let us say, high school. We'll get back to that in a minute. He graduated from high school 1915 to 1922. And in those years, the whole world was excited about what was happening in archaeology, and had sort of inspired or inflamed my father's imagination coming out of school as a young man, 1922. So, for example, it was all about Leonard Woolley and the excavations at Ur of the Chaldees, or it was about Howard Carter and the excavations at the tomb of Tutankhamun in Egypt. My father told these to me as stories. I mean, this wasn't kind of lecture style. Anything that smacked of the school would not have been appreciated. This was fun and entertainment as we walked. He told me all about it. Now that meant that the first time I ever heard of Ur of the Chaldees, it was not about Abraham or the Bible. The Bible wasn't even on my horizon. And the first time I heard about the Valley of the Kings or Tutankhamun in Egypt, it wasn't about the Exodus. It wasn't about the Bible. It was about magnificent stories about history and geography, because my father was an armchair historian and an armchair geographer. He told them as stories. Years later, well, 20 years later, when I was at Ur of the Chaldees and climbed up to the top of the ziggurat, there was no guards there, so you could pretty much do what you wanted, actually, on the ruins, without damaging them, of course. I wasn't really thinking so much of the Bible and Abraham as my father and the Dublin Road. I wasn't confirming the Bible. I was confirming my father, if I could put it that way. So I was saved from fundamentalism. I began to read those, first of all, as magnificent stories, similar to the ones that I'd heard from my father. It didn't mean that I couldn't think, well, did this happen, did that not happen? Of course. But it was within the matrix of story. So if I thought it hadn't exactly happened as I read it, say, in Genesis, that didn't mean I dismissed it. That made it just more fascinating, more of an adventure. And the same thing for Tutankhamun's mummy in the Cairo Museum, again, this would be the 60s, walked around the Valley of the Kings around his tomb. I was thinking of the Bible, of course, but I was thinking also my father and the Naas Dublin Road and the 40s. And all of that, in a profound way that I no way appreciated at the time, saved my soul from fundamentalism. Saved ruining the Bible by insisting that everything is literal, when everything I knew by the time I was 16 was that not the way the world worked. So, there was one other thing my father did besides those stories, and it linked to them. He had learned huge amounts of poetry by heart. Now, we're not talking great poetry. These are not Shakespearean sonnets. If he had done anything like that smacked of the classroom, it wouldn't have worked. This was fun and entertainment. So, all his poetry had rhythm and rhyme, and was story. I can't remember a single poem my father ever quoted me that wasn't basically a story. So, here was the test. Here was, again, I'm back with challenge, accomplishment, and adventure. My father would recite poetry to me, the poetry that he knew by heart, and I would see if I could memorize it back. We were just having fun to see what I could learn. Now, for example, a poem that he would recite to me, and it's not great poetry. It's rather magnificent doggerel. It's the only way you could describe it. The great fight between Abdul, Abulbul, Amir, and Ivan Skavinsky, Skavar. Their very names are rhythmic. And I can still remember to this day one verse, a Muscovite maiden her lone vigil keeps by the light of the pale polar moon. And the name that she utters as oft time she weeps is Ivan Skavinsky Skavar. Didn't check on it, that might be off a bit, but that's the way I remember it. So really my memory was being trained, and it was all fun, as I said. I wasn't thinking of, this is education. Secondly, the great poem by John Masefield, Cargoes. I probably didn't know John Masefield at the time. My father probably wouldn't have mentioned that, or it was over my head. I found that out later. The opening line, a quinquereme from Nineveh. That's the one line I really remember well, because he had to explain to me what the quinquereme was and where Nineveh was. So if Ur was in what is now southern Iraq, Nineveh was now northern Iraq. Again, years later, in the 60s, when I crossed from Mosul over the Tigris to Nineveh, walked around the ruins of Nineveh one whole day. Once again, I wasn't really thinking about Jonah. Okay, look, I probably had it at the back of my mind, the story of Jonah and the Bible and Nineveh, and whether a prophet could spend some time in the belly of a whale without basic structural damage. Sure, that was probably there. But the big thing was, this is Nineveh, and I first met it on the Naas Dublin Road 20-some years ago. Again, it was a story, but now it was the matrix of poetry. So I got a profound effect on my imagination, not just my knowledge or my memory, but that too, but on my imagination, that history and geography came in the matrix of poetry, and especially poetic poetry. And without having a clue at the time, my father was preparing me to be a biblical scholar and not lose my mind or my soul in the process. This photograph will serve as a termination, a climax, shall we say, for this first part of my autobiography. As you can tell, it says it's the 6th standard, the 6th grade of CBS, which is the Christian Brothers School in Naas, County Kildare, of course, where we were living. And the date is 1944 to 1945. So it's the year I changed from being 10 to 11 in February of that year. This is not a graduation picture. It's a confirmation picture. That's why it was taken. That's why I still have it, I suppose. I hope that the grimace on my face, because I am in the middle of the front row, as you can see, I hope that grimace isn't because of impending confirmation. Actually, if I knew what was coming, which I didn't, maybe the impending changes in my life, and there were rather big ones coming up, might have made me grimace a little as well. But in any case, I conclude with this photograph from the 6th grade because, as fate was going to have it, I was going to skip the 7th and the 8th grade of what we call primary school or elementary school and move directly into high school. But that is a story for the next part of my autobiography.